Klobuchar is, as I understand it, next remotely.
Very, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here. My state has the highest voter turnout in the country persistently, and we have elected Democratic governors, Republican governors, and Jesse Ventura. And I guess one of the things I've learned from that is what's most important is that people vote and they feel like they are part of the democracy. And what really concerns me about these efforts, which are blatant attempts to limit the freedom to vote, is they're literally messing around with the foundation of our country. So I guess I would start with you, Mr. Garza, because I met today with a number of the Texas legislators, along with Senator Warnock and Senator Merkley, because Senator Merkley and I lead the For the People bill. Which provisions of the legislation that is now being considered in Texas are you most concerned with?
It's a bad bill all the way around. There are prohibitions limiting the time frame for when people can vote. I think that's concerning. There was a misstatement made about how local elected officials are prohibited from sending ballots to voters. Actually, they're prohibited from sending applications for mail-in ballots. And there are, those actions are criminalized so that there are efforts then that intimidate local election officials from trying to help people vote, assist people in voting. And I think those are
and isn't it also the fact that if you have more than 3 people that you're taking to the polls, you have to sign some kind of statement or affidavit?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So there are restrictions on assisting voters to the polls and assisting voters at the polls. And so those things.
And also defining your disability. Is that there's something in there on that?
Yes. Yeah. And so additional affidavits that need to be filed by voters. I think all of the things that are included in the bill are things that have been tested and have increased voter participation. And so there is no evidence of voter fraud regarding these matters. There is evidence of increased voter participation. And those are the things that are being limited.
All right, thank you. Ms. Nelson, just along these lines, Sue, we've identified a lot of these issues. Georgia has passed a law that is kind of unbelievable in some of its provisions. How does the For the People Act? We know the John Lewis Act will help in one important way with identifying those policies and states that engage in discriminatory conduct, and going forward, which is one of the issues that would be forward-looking, they'd have to come before the Justice Department for approval. But the For the People Act is actually firmly grounded in the Constitution. There's a provision in the Constitution that has never been doubted that says that Congress can make and alter provisions governing federal elections. And that's one of the things that interests me so much about the bill. Could you talk about some of the important protections in this and how it would just simply create some basic national standards for voting instead of this mess, including how we count the ballots after, with some states, including some blue states, waiting and not even starting counting them until after the election's over, and then everyone's kept in suspense for weeks. Anyway, go ahead.
Sure. The For the People Act is a very comprehensive and expansive piece of legislation that equalizes voting across all of the states. Senator Cornyn made the point for me in many ways by pointing out that there's early voting in Texas and none in Connecticut. I think we've learned over the course of several decades that expanding opportunities for eligible Americans to vote only enhances our democracy. It only invites more people to exercise a fundamental constitutional right. And it's something that we should all be encouraging. The For the People Act does that by creating a baseline of 2 weeks of early voting across the country. It also creates a program of automatic voter registration so that only eligible Americans will be automatically registered. It takes the onus off of everyday Americans to have to register themselves. And unlike what Senator Cruz said earlier. It doesn't allow people who are not eligible to vote to be registered. It limits it only to those eligible Americans, which is a benefit for all Americans. It also includes same-day registration as well as online registration, and includes a number of other provisions, including welcoming returning citizens back into our electorate after they have served their time. These are all democracy expanding provisions that we now know 67% of voters support. Unlike much of the rhetoric we've heard today, the principles of the For the People Act are overwhelmingly supported by the American electorate. And that includes 56% of Republican voters, 68% of independent voters, and 77% of Democratic voters. This shows that this law is not a partisan issue. It's not partisan propaganda. It is an American issue, and it strengthens our democracy across the board.
Well, and I would note your point about people voting after they've completed their sentences, their prison sentences. Florida, while electing Republicans statewide, actually voted overwhelmingly, I think it was 65%, to allow people who had completed their prison sentences to vote. And so I think one of the points we want to make here, and that I made as chair of the Rules Committee, is that this you have just done. There is significant bipartisan support, as we saw during the pandemic, for people voting safely in the way that they would prefer. And that's the core of this bill. And that's why I know we will eventually be successful. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Lee.
Mr. Cuccinelli, you served as the Attorney General of the state of Virginia, both before the Shelby